Hi everyone, it's B. Long time no see. Sorry I've been gone for a while. Life got a little crazy there for a bit, but I'm happy to be back right in time for my favorite time of year, spooky season. Today's video is going to be a new addition to my Women of Survival Horror series where I will be talking about Alyssa Hamilton, the protagonist of the 2002 Capcom game Clock Tower 3. So, as always, before I start these sorts of videos, I will include the content warnings on the screen here because I know that the content of many survival horror games isn't necessarily lighthearted and can cover topics that people might not necessarily be comfortable seeing or hearing about, and I totally get that. Lucky for us, though, this is definitely not one of the darkest survival horror games I've ever covered, so it's really not that bad, but just in case. Also, now would probably be a good time to go get yourself a snack or some coffee before we get into the synopsis portion of the video. Don't worry, I'll wait. I got all day. Not going anywhere. So, to start off, it's important to note that Clock Tower 3 is obviously the third game in the Clock Tower series, the first of which came out in 1995 in Japan, 1996 in the US, and the second of which came out in 1998 in Japan, 1999 in the US. Unlike the first two games in the series, though, Clock Tower 3 is not a point-and-click adventure game and instead plays much more similarly to modern survival horror games. Luckily, for the sake of brevity in this video, the main character of Clock Tower 3, Alyssa Hamilton, makes her first appearance in the series in Clock Tower 3, so that's where we will begin. Clock Tower 3 begins with our 14-year-old English protagonist, Alyssa, walking the grounds of her boarding school while reading a letter explaining that after her grandfather went missing 3 years ago, she was sent away to boarding school and told not to come back for at least 6 years, which is incredibly specific. The letter from her mother goes on to say that even though Alyssa was never provided an explanation for this, she's sorry for sending her away, but she did it to protect her. Her mother Nancy then warns Alyssa that her 15th birthday is going to put her in more danger than ever before, and demands that she go into hiding until her birthday passes. As soon as she finishes reading the letter, she's told that her mother has called and is waiting to talk to her, so she runs to the phone. She picks up the phone and says hello repeatedly to no answer, as it's shown to us that the phone is knocked off the hook at her mother's home and no one is there, which of course begs the question of who called her in the first place. Alyssa hurriedly returns to her family home. The house appears to be empty, so she calls for her mom, and a door to her left opens on its own. Inside, she finds a tall man dressed in a black trench coat, claiming to be one of the lodges in the home. Alyssa introduces herself and asks where her mother is. The man claims that she left yesterday morning, saying that she wouldn't be back for quite some time, but then corrects himself by saying that she won't be coming back at all, and that Alyssa is all alone in this world now. The man then rushes toward Alyssa and grabs her by the back of her school blazer, gripping her face and saying, "My sweet Alyssa, I've been waiting so long for this moment." Alyssa pushes the man off and yells, "Get away from me!" The man just laughs and walks up the stairs in the main hall of the home in response. This is where the actual game itself really starts, as we begin to control Alyssa and explore the house. Another important thing to note at this point in the game is that it seems that Alyssa's parents are very well off and rent out the rooms of their massive home to guests as a sort of bed and breakfast, meaning that there are many doors that are locked around the home because they're reserved for guests. Another detail to note is that the game is saved through diary entries, usually located on a small wooden table very similar to the typewriter system used in many Resident Evil games. I just wanted to mention that because I feel that using diary entries rather than something like a typewriter is a good reminder every now and then that this is a 14-year-old girl we're playing as, and there's quite literally nothing more important to a 14-year-old girl than the contents of her diary. Alyssa makes her way up the grand staircase and begins exploring the upstairs rooms of the home. This is where we first find a bottle of lavender water, something that will come in handy very often as the game continues, and it can be used to calm Alyssa down during parts of the game where she enters panic mode, but we'll get back to that later. A little further into the exploration of the upstairs of the home, Alyssa finds a wooden door with a blue sigil glowing on it. When she goes to open the door, she receives an electric shock that causes the lights in the hallway to begin flickering, and this prompts a text box explaining the panic mode that I just mentioned. Alyssa then finds a fireplace in one of the rooms of the home. The fire in the fireplace burns out, allowing Alyssa to crawl through the hole into a hidden room containing a Greek-looking statue of a woman that begins crying blood. The statue's head falls off, and Alyssa finds hidden within it a sacred bottle of holy water and a note from her mother explaining that she can use this holy water to perform exorcisms, which temporarily stun enemies, to destroy sigils, which break seals that block her path, and that she will have to refill her holy water from time to time. The letter also goes on to explain that she will be up against many spirits, and that in order to protect herself from them and set them free, she has to find their sentimental item. Her mother finishes the letter by telling her that she loves her more than anything else in the whole wide world. Going back to that room with the blue sigil on the door, Alyssa can now use her holy water to destroy the sigil and allow her to access the room. Inside, she enters her mother's room and looks around, finding evidence that her mom must have left in a hurry. She sees a family photo lying tipped over on the desk and takes a moment to fix it before sitting down on the bed and talking out loud to her mom, despite the fact that she obviously isn't there. Alyssa moves the bed sheets to find a book under her mom's pillow, bookmarked to a page with an image of the same trench coat wearing man Alyssa had just encountered downstairs. This terrifies her and she stands up, frantically looking around as chaotic classical music begins playing. She checks the CD player, finding that the noise must be coming from somewhere else. She opens the door and runs out, somehow having been transported through a portal to a World War II era London, which is currently being bombed. She ducks for cover under a nearby bus until it begins to tip over, and just as suddenly as it started, the bombing stops. Soon after, she finds the gruesome body of a dead man laying out in the street with an empty jewelry box by his hand and a ghost demanding that Alyssa give her back the ring. Alyssa finds the engagement ring inside of a nearby phone booth. She places the ring back in the box and the ghost dissipates, leaving behind a sigil stone. When Alyssa examines the body once more before leaving, a text box pops up saying, "I hope I did some good." We soon figure out that our destination is the concert hall, which seems to be where the frantic piano music is coming from. As Alyssa walks around, she will come across sentimental items and be pursued by the ghost to which these items belong, and she can be scared by them if they get too close to her. But generally, not really a big threat. Inside of a nearby tailor shop, she finds a news article about the murder of a 12-year-old girl and pianist named May Norton on Christmas Day of 1942. It stated that she was brutally bludgeoned to death with a heavy blunt object and that the case is unsolved with no suspects. It's also said that May Norton played at the piano concours at the concert hall that Alyssa heard music coming from earlier on. Also, based on a poster seen in the area, we can assume that the day Alyssa has been transported back to is the day May Norton was murdered, Christmas Day of 1942. After looking up from the newspaper, Alyssa hears a scream and we see a scene of May Norton being attacked by a gigantic man with a mallet in her bedroom, and we watch as May is hit over the head with the mallet and her bloody body slumps down the stairs in front of Alyssa. The perpetrator steps into the hallway and says, "I killed her," to Alyssa, who turns to run. This is the first major enemy of the game who begins chasing Alyssa. At this point in the game, Alyssa doesn't have any means of protecting herself other than stunning enemies with her holy water, hiding, and evading. The closeness of enemies to Alyssa's location is indicated by the volume of music, very similar to Haunting Ground. By the way, I'm not sure I've mentioned it before, but although Haunting Ground isn't an official entry into the Clock Tower series, it's considered to be a spiritual successor to Clock Tower 3. So if you're familiar with Haunting Ground and notice a bunch of similarities between the two games, that's why. When the coast is clear, Alyssa can make her way to May's room and take a look at her diary. It's nothing too serious, mostly just concerns about her father. Alyssa also picks up an invitation to the piano concours, but then is quickly interrupted by the mallet-wielding man breaking down the door. This time, instead of running, Alyssa grabs a nearby chair and hits the man with him, pushes him over, and rushes past him, which is our first demonstration of Alyssa's resourcefulness. This is also when we find out that just because you're out of the building, that does not necessarily mean that you're safe, as the pursuers can follow you outside and chase you there as well. Eventually, Alyssa finds her way to the concert hall and walks in. The doors lock behind her and require a special key to exit. Alyssa finds the room where the music has been coming from and opens the door. There we find a piano drenched in blood sitting in a spotlight on the stage. After freaking out for a minute, understandably, Alyssa notices that although the bench was empty at first glance, she can now see that a bloody and ghost-like May Norton is the one playing at the piano. May keeps messing up the music that she's playing and she begins to cry out of frustration with herself. The mallet man returns, chases May away, and Alyssa has to face him once again. She finds a lever behind the stage curtains and uses it, unfortunately dropping a dead man off the stage left in the process, who just so happens to have a piece of paper with a safe code written on it. She uses it to open a safe containing a master key, which allows her to gain access to the rest of the rooms at the concert hall. During this first pursuit, we also find out what happens when Alyssa's panic meter gets up too high. When Alyssa enters panic mode, she screams, freezes, and the screen's colors become negative. While she's panicking, her steps become much more uneasy and she flails around as she runs. This leaves Alyssa much more vulnerable than before to the attacks of enemies, so making sure that Alyssa stays calm is very important to her chances of survival. During the same pursuit with this first enemy, Alyssa shows her resourcefulness once again by throwing what looks like a violin case at a stack of boxes that tumble down on her pursuer and keep him busy for a while as she runs away. After the concert hall, Alyssa returns to the tailor shop and finds a box on top of the fireplace, which starts a cutscene of May Norton practicing at the piano in her home and her dad coming home to tell her that he's going off to war. It's World War II. Again, just a reminder. May tells her dad that she's going to practice really hard and try and win the piano contest because the winner will have their performance aired on the radio, and that way he'll still be able to hear it. The piece that May intends on playing is a song that plays upon opening a pocket watch her mother gave to her dad as a wedding present. As we find out, May's father is killed in the war, still holding the pocket watch, the same watch that can now be found in the box on top of the fireplace, along with a news article chronicling the crimes committed by Robert Morris, aka the Hammer Killer, who had been hanged in September of 1941. Morris was said to have murdered 12 people with no clear motive, and this man is obviously presumed to be the same man who has been chasing Alyssa during this part of the game. Alyssa takes the pocket watch and makes her way back to the concert hall so that she can give it to May and hopefully put her at peace. When she arrives at the concert hall, she runs into the Hammer Killer who says, "You figured me out, little girl. They thought they'd gotten rid of me that day at the gallows, but they were wrong. Little May was only the beginning." During this conflict, Alyssa questions him about why he murdered May, and then immediately after we enter the first boss battle of the game. Now, there's no way I could really prepare you for this next part, but at the start of the boss battle, Alyssa goes through like a Sailor Moon magical girl transformation, and her bottle of holy water turns into a magical bow and arrow. I don't really have much to say about that except slay! I love it. This game is so silly. As the boss battle starts, our enemy is introduced as Sledgehammer. He has a victim count of 26, and a meter shows up on the screen stating that he's been sentenced to 486 years, and then that meter fills up and the number ticks down to 0 years. The combat begins with the word Judgment appearing in big letters on the screen. Alyssa then uses long-range attacks with her bow and arrow to deal damage to Sledgehammer. The more damage she does to Sledgehammer, the more the meter at the bottom of the screen goes up, indicating the amount of years he's sentenced to as it begins to count back up. Also, if Alyssa shoots an arrow up at the sky, a sigil forms in the clouds and a huge blast of light beams down on her enemy, dealing a huge amount of damage and ending the battle. After Sledgehammer is killed, Alyssa picks up an item called the Clover of Love and continues into the concert hall to find May. She finds May once again playing the piano and crying. She walks over to her and opens the pocket watch so that it plays the song and tells her that her father has died, having been exploded during the war. I maybe would have left that detail out, but I get it. Immediately after telling her, May begins to cry, and Alyssa rushes to her side and comforts her, saying, "I'm so sorry, please don't cry, I understand how you feel," and begins to tell her that she never knew her father, but she felt the same way about her grandfather as May does about her dad, and losing him was just as difficult. She tells May to keep the watch as a memento of her father and to continue practicing the piano as hard as she can because she knows it'll make him happy. May goes back to playing the piano, and suddenly she hears her voice being said and looks up to see a white and gilded staircase with her father calling to her with his arms wide open. She runs to him and they hug. He says that her beautiful piano playing brought him back to her. They both thank Alyssa for her help and ascend into heaven. Alyssa enthusiastically waves goodbye to both of them before collapsing to the ground and waking up in her own home, in her own bed, as if it was all just a dream. As she sits in her bed, she begins to hear a knock at the window. She goes to investigate and sees her friend Dennis banging on it. She pulls him in and he immediately gets comfy in her bed and begins catching up with her since they hadn't seen each other in about 3 years. She takes her pillow from him, smacks him with it, and then asks him what he's doing entering a lady's room through a window. He gives her a key to her grandfather's room, which is suspicious since the key is always in her mother's possession, so she begins frantically questioning him about where and when he had seen her mother. He says it was yesterday morning and that he was told to give her the key if she couldn't make it back in time, which indicates to Alyssa that her mom was on her way to come visit her when she vanished. Completely misreading the situation, Dennis tries to put the moves on with Alyssa, but she ignores him at first, turning to run away to her grandfather's room before she pauses and basically tackles him onto her bed, and she jokingly flirts with him for a moment before running away again, leaving him in her room, probably very confused. I think this whole scene is just very cute and motion captured very well. I just wanted to point it out because I think this is a very early 2000s rom-com kind of scene, and it totally looks like something two goofy and painfully awkward teenagers would do. Despite the horrors Alyssa has experienced since the start of the game, she's still very silly and playful and childish at times, and I think it's cool to see how dynamic she can be as a character. We'll get back to that later during the character analysis part of the video, but for now I just wanted to toss that little tidbit in there. Anywho, Alyssa uses the key that she had just obtained to enter her grandfather's room, which has creepy masks lining the walls. She finds a note on the desk reading, "The keys to the mystery of time lie behind you," and a book entitled The Book of Entities, which describes what he calls entities, which are beings capable of possessing humans and causing them to commit violent acts. These subordinates or possessed people cannot be stopped even after being killed because the entity will continue to resurrect them and force them to commit even more murders. This book also describes for the first time what exactly Alyssa's mother was trying to warn her about as her 15th birthday approaches. The book says that rooters are young women in their teens and that for centuries only these women are able to fight entities and those who they possess. This is what Alyssa is, and that is why she's able to take down enemies like Sledgehammer. Dennis comes barging in soon after Alyssa finishes reading, and the two begin looking at the book together. Also, I'm sorry, but the scenes with Dennis in them are very funny to me because he looks and sounds so much like Ron Weasley that it's genuinely kind of distracting. I just wanted to say that because I couldn't think of any other time that I could fit this into the script, but I had to mention it. So anyways, Alyssa tells Dennis that somehow she feels that her mother is nearby, and since he doesn't seem to be following what she's trying to say, she snaps at him and tries to storm out of the room to take care of this on her own, but Dennis stands in the way and insists that he be allowed to help her. The two of them catch up some more after Alyssa relents and agrees to let him help her. She assigns him to the upstairs of the house while she sets out to explore the downstairs of the house. Before she leaves the room though, Dennis asks if he correctly remembered that her birthday is tomorrow, which it is. Dennis seems very proud of himself for having remembered this. Alyssa, however, seems nervous and horrified at the thought since she was specifically instructed to go into hiding before her 15th birthday was to arrive, but clearly that really isn't an option anymore. Shortly after splitting up from Dennis, Alyssa comes upon a hidden office behind the fireplace in her mother's bedroom. Using a portal in the ground, Alyssa is transported back through time to the 1960s home of two murder victims, a mother and son who were killed and found stuffed inside acid barrels in their own garage. It's also specified in the news article Alyssa finds lying on the ground outside of the home that the mother was legally blind and that her son, though he had fine vision in life, had his eyes gouged out prior to being murdered. The murders, though still unsolved at the time, do have a suspect who's believed to be a distant relative of the mother who has not yet been found by police. Upon entering the home, Alyssa finds the walls and floors to be absolutely drenched in blood and quickly comes across a man in the hallway. She panics and ducks under a small end table in an attempt to hide from him as he, eyeless and bloodied, walks through the halls ringing a bell. Somehow he notices Alyssa's presence and begins questioning her, but this only scares her and she says nothing in response until he walks away. She then finds his mother soon after, crying and looking for her son, Albert, because it seems that they haven't been able to find each other in the house despite the fact that they're both ringing bells. As Alyssa enters the room, the woman panics and begins frantically ringing the bell that she's holding, and this causes all of the furniture in the room to begin thrashing around, tossing Alyssa against the wall and slamming her to the ground. After running away and exploring the house a bit more, she finds out that a relative of the mom named John Hay, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, so we're just going to call him John, a convicted serial killer whose MO is to murder victims, then dump their bodies into drums of sulfuric acid, had recently stayed with the mother and son just a short time before they were both killed. However, it's noted that he had fallen off a platform at his place of work into a vat of acid and died in a very ironic way. Don't forget though, if you're a subordinate, you can just keep being resurrected over and over again. So he's not really dead, and this is our next pursuer. Outside of the home once more, Alyssa is refilling her holy water at one of the fountains when she suddenly sees a vision of her mother, who doesn't acknowledge her calls and instead disappears, leaving behind a desk key. Using the portal once more, Alyssa ends back up in her mother's room in present day. She runs to her grandfather's room and uses the desk key, finding in a desk drawer a book entitled The Book of Entities 2, which explains how to defeat the possessed subordinates of entities. It basically says that they need to be healed first with a sentimental item, and then a portal will appear holding within it the necessary weapon to defeat the subordinate, which is why she has a holy water bow. She also finds in the drawer a strange mask and an order for camera film. Placing the strange mask on an empty hook on the wall allows Alyssa to enter the next room, where she finds the camera film and a note from her grandfather dating back to 1978, which chronicles the Reuter bloodline within her family and within many parts of Europe. It seems, based on the note, that becoming a Reuter is something that is passed down genetically from the mother to her female child, first from her maternal grandmother Francesca, then to her mother Nancy, and now to Alyssa. A second note, dating to 1984, explains more of the genetic aspect of being a Reuter. It says that these powers that allow Reuters to fight the forces of darkness first show up during a girl's early teens and peak at age 15, again showing the significance of Alyssa's birthday being tomorrow. It also explains that after age 15, these powers begin to deteriorate and disappear completely by age 20, because after that point, it's up to them to get married and have kids so that the next generation can continue fighting the forces of darkness with their Reuter powers. It feels a little bit gross and outdated, but moving on. After Alyssa finishes reading, she walks over to her grandfather's portrait on the wall and says, "Leave it to me, Grandpa. I have the same Reuter strain in my blood as my mother," and comes to terms with the fact that she will need to save Dorothy and Albert, the mother and son that were murdered, if she ever wants to see her mom again. She gladly and confidently takes on this responsibility, despite that obviously being quite the daunting task for a 14-year-old to take on. Alyssa teleports herself back to the house of the mother and son and gets to work. I just want to quickly interject here and say, is it really a retro survival horror game without an area with a super gross looking bathroom in it? No. Not sure why, but there's always a super gross looking bathroom in every single retro survival horror game ever, but I appreciate the continuity. Anyways, while in one of the outside buildings on the property, Alyssa sees a vision of Albert and his mother Dorothy interacting prior to the murder, which is actually a very cute scene. Immediately after this cute little scene, the murderer barges in, laughing maniacally, and begins spraying them with what looks like what you'd use for pest control and swinging an axe around before dunking them both into an oil drum and dumping acid all over them both. He then turns his attention to Alyssa, who takes a bottle of something flammable and throws it at him as he begins using the gas sprayer he's holding, which causes him to set himself on fire. This provides her enough time to get away from him. She continues exploring the house, looking for some way to help Albert and Dorothy while still being pursued by the man. At some point, Alyssa becomes cornered by the man and she throws a fire extinguisher at him, causing it to create a big foggy cloud within the room and give her a quick getaway. Once again showing that same resourcefulness we've seen so many times. Another time, she uses a switch on the wall to electrocute the man. Not sure why there's an electrocution switch on the wall outside of this person's house, but this isn't a very serious game, so we can suspend our disbelief a little bit. Anywho, Alyssa spots the shawl Dorothy's son had made for her from afar and begins to make her way towards it, as that's definitely the sentimental item she's going to need to help Dorothy's spirit move on. Alyssa retrieves the shawl and soon after is confronted by the pursuer, who calls her a stupid wench, which is a very silly insult. Alyssa says, "You can't beat me, I'll destroy you," which is very confident of her. The man responds by saying, "None of your lip, little girl. You have your own destiny to escape." I just want to quickly mention that at this point, this is the third time that one of the enemies in the game has referred to her as little girl. First the man with the trench coat, then the sledgehammer, now him. He also says that it's her destiny to die. After this, the next boss battle of the game begins, and Alyssa goes through her little magical girl transformation. This time the pursuer's name is Corroder, his victim count is 31, and the sentence to counter starts at 605 before counting down to 0, similar to the first boss battle. This battle is generally the exact same as the last, with the only weapon being used being the bow and arrow. Generally, the combat is exactly the same. Run, take the bow out, hold it so that the arrow powers up, shoot, run, repeat. Once again, the battle ends with Alyssa shooting an arrow up in the sky and a ball of light coming down from the clouds to obliterate her pursuer. Alyssa picks up another clover. This time it's the Clover of Courage. She heads back to the house to talk to Dorothy and finds her crying. She takes out the shawl her son made her and walks over to the crying woman and places it over her shoulders. After this, the blood beneath Dorothy's eyes suddenly disappears and she exclaims that she can see. Her son enters the room and they embrace, both now being able to see as Alyssa watches from the corner of the room. They both thank her for her help and Alyssa says goodbye to both of them as they ascend into heaven. Rather than falling unconscious as she did last time after helping May Norton and her father, this time the room begins to shake and the lights go dark. She stands up and turns around realizing that she had been teleported back into her family home and the man in the trench coat is there on the staircase waiting for her. He comments on the strength of her ruder powers and then casts some sort of spell that flings Alyssa into the air and spins her around with such force that the house explodes and Alyssa finds herself flying through the air on the face of a giant clock up a winding staircase toward the sky. There's a really fun song playing during this part and I love it, so I'm going to play it in the background while I'm talking. Alyssa has flown up to the top of this gigantic clock tower and there she meets the man again, where he informs her that this is the realm that he rules over and it's currently 2 hours till her 15th birthday officially arrives and her powers will reach their peak, and they will become one, achieving eternal life. He sweeps Alyssa off her feet and spins her in circles while cradling her in his arms. As this is happening, Alyssa is frantically flailing about trying to free herself from his grasp, and the man tells her that her mother is already dead, showing her the body of her mother, which Alyssa refuses to believe is real. The man says, if you don't believe me, you can go to hell and see for yourself. He then tosses Alyssa through a hole at the top of the clock tower, which sends her plummeting to the bottom. She wakes up in a dark and watery cavern and begins to try and find her way out. It's in this watery industrial area that Alyssa comes across her next pursuer. This one can walk on walls, looks like a very skinny version of Kratos from God of War, dual wields axes, and has an awesome pursuer song, which I'll play in the background. I love the soundtrack for this game. At some point during the pursuit, Alyssa hides herself in an oil drum, which prompts the pursuer to throw one of his axes at it. This punctures a hole in the drum, causes some oil to spill out, and a nearby fire sets the pursuer aflame. Alyssa's very good at setting people on fire. I'm happy for her. Alyssa finally finds some refuge from the industrial water area, walking into what looks like a home. She finds a stuffed rabbit toy and remarks that it cannot be the one that she was given when she was a child, meaning that she probably has a very similar one, or at least did when she was little. A baby can be heard crying somewhere nearby, and while Alyssa searches for the baby, she spots on a table a statue that was given to her by her mom, and it's supposed to be in her room at home, so she wonders what it could possibly be doing in the basement of this clock tower. As Alyssa continues wandering around this new area, she quickly figures out that it almost perfectly mirrors her home, but with little things here and there that seem out of place, like a rocking horse in the corner by the fireplace. In the upstairs hallway of the home, Alyssa tries one of the locked doors and notices that her mother's name is written on it, which is unusual because her mother's room is located elsewhere in the house, or at least it's supposed to be. Alyssa walks down the grand staircase and begins hearing a woman humming, and as she nears a set of doors that swing open and reveal her mom, rocking her as a baby as though she had walked into a memory of her infancy. In the memory, her mom tells baby Alyssa about a necklace that had been passed down in her family for generations and provides an explanation for the clovers that Alyssa has been picking up after each boss battle. She says that there are 4 leaves to this clover: love, friendship, hope, and courage, and notes that when these leaves are put together, the wearer will find true happiness. In this memory, baby Alyssa laughs for the first time, which is initially a happy moment that is quickly interrupted by the sound of a fight happening just outside between her grandfather and her dad. During the fight, Alyssa's grandfather pushes her dad over the balcony of the home, and he lands on an axe that's leaning against a log down below, killing him. At this point, the clover necklace breaks apart and the leaves scatter. Alyssa runs from the balcony toward her father's body on the ground below, clearly very shocked and emotional at learning that the reason she never got to know her father was because he died at the hands of her beloved grandfather. Without even giving her half a second to comprehend what she had just experienced, the pursuer finds her and pins her against a column on the house with an axe to her throat. He gives a monologue about how Alyssa now knows the truth about her father's death and about her grandfather's involvement in it. Alyssa refuses to believe this at first, and then immediately after, the next boss battle begins. Magical girl transformation, magic bow, blah blah blah. I think you get the boss battles at this point. This pursuer's name is listed as Chopper. His victim count is 44, and his sentence to counter begins at 921 years before counting down to 0 as as per the usual. This time though, after Alyssa goes to shoot her final shot to end the battle, Chopper doesn't die. Instead, he says that she will suffer the same fate as all the rest, and what looks like a very deep puddle of water opens up on the ground beneath Alyssa's feet, and she begins to sink into it, waking up in a dark cemetery all alone. She holds in her hand another note from her grandfather where he talks about his distaste for the man that his daughter Nancy chose to marry and have a child with, Alyssa's father. He particularly disliked that Alyssa's father didn't want Alyssa to become a rooter when she grew up, and this was quite the problem in her grandfather's eyes. He admits in the note that he did in fact kill Alyssa's father, but he did it because he couldn't allow the Rooter bloodline to die out. Within the cemetery, Alyssa finds a group of 5 dancing ghosts and 5 more ghosts holding swords with flames on the end, all of which are women. Each of the 5 with swords talk about the demise they met while fighting entities during their lifetimes, presumably because each of these women were also Rooters when they were alive. One of the ghosts remarks that her heart was stolen from her so that an entity could perform the ritual of engagement. Alyssa asks what this ritual is, but before she can get an answer, all of the ghosts disappear. Back in the normal cemetery, Alyssa comes across a car parked at the entrance. While looking at it, she is suddenly attacked by Chopper again, and he says that this is what happens to those who dare to stand against us, referring to the terrible deaths each of the Rooter women in the cemetery had met. He then states that he is after her heart because the ritual will soon start. That rhymed, and I didn't realize until just now. The boss battle doesn't continue just yet. Instead, she is being pursued again for a while. During this pursuit, Alyssa finds the Book of Entities, numero 3. I don't speak Spanish, sorry. This one describes a woodcutter by the name of Harold Powell who had dismembered a woman with an axe who had rejected his marriage proposal. After this initial murder, the man went on to abduct more young girls and butcher them until 2 years later he was caught and killed by villagers. Obviously, this story is that of Chopper, Alyssa's current pursuer, another reincarnated subordinate who is made by an entity to hunt rooters like Alyssa. Within the cemetery, Alyssa also finds a note written by her mother which says that the heart of a rooter is necessary for the ritual engagement, particularly one of a girl who has reached her 15th birthday. It also seems that this is only really a problem for girls on their actual 15th birthday, as hiding until her 15th birthday was over would prevent this from being a problem. Seems like a very short window of opportunity for these entities to get her heart. Kinda sounds inconvenient, if I do say so myself. After completing another puzzle, Alyssa unlocks a new portal which takes her to a dark cave where she finds what looks like a shrine, the door of which says, "If thy true desire is to become an entity, there is no purer path than this. Remove the heart of a 15-year-old rooter of the same bloodline, and before the beat of her heart is stilled, drink deeply of her blood. Thus will the ritual of engagement be completed, and the dark power of the entity shall be thine." If all these women have to be from the same bloodline, I would hope that the parents of rooters would at least try to have more than one child in case their 15-year-olds keep being murdered so that the bloodline can live on, you know? It just seems kind of hard to keep a bloodline going if all the girls keep getting murdered before they even graduate high school. Anyways, after reading this, Alyssa worries aloud about who wants to drink her blood to become an entity. Just as she finishes that sentence, a sigil floats down from the sky with a golden arrow called the Old Rooter Arrow that Alyssa will use during her next boss battle, which begins immediately after she re-enters the cemetery. Chopper says, "Alyssa, what chance does a pathetic little girl like you have to bring salvation to the dead rooters? None." Once again, the same old little girl line. It just seems a bit ironic to me that by all of the enemies she is called a little girl, and yet because of the responsibilities put on her by her family and momentous things expected of her because of her bloodline, it's like she has to prove that by stopping this ritual from happening, setting the spirits free, and defeating the subordinates and the entity, that she is a woman and she deserves to be treated as more than just a child. It's kind of like a rite of passage. This time, at the end of the boss battle, Chopper does actually die, and Alyssa receives the Clover of Hope, leaving one clover left to go. The ghosts of the Rooter women, and therefore her ancestors who died working toward the same cause that Alyssa is right now, thank Alyssa for saving them. Right after these ghosts ascend into heaven, her mom appears behind her. They hug, and then the sweet moment is cut short by the man in the trench coat holding her mother captive. Her mom is taken from her, and Alyssa is teleported into a bizarre room surrounded by statues and a huge spiral staircase. She cries out for her mom, and instead of her mom responding, she hears Dennis running toward her. They hug and they fall to the ground holding each other as she cries to him, showing him the almost completed clover necklace. Dennis says that everything will be okay because he's going to help her get that last leaf in time so she can see her mom again. His encouragement gives her the boost she needs, and the two set off together to find the last clover. Alyssa and Dennis walk through a tunnel and end up on what looks like a normal modern-day street where a woman can be seen sticking her head out of the window of one of the buildings calling for Dennis. Turns out that this is his sister, who he said wasn't going to be back for 6 months. They go running in despite Alyssa finding this to be very suspicious. Dennis runs up and hugs his sister, who quickly shapeshifts into a pursuer, and guess what? There's 2 of them this time. They're basically like Team Rocket if Team Rocket slayed. Well, slayed more, I guess. These 2 pursuers each have 2 halves of a pair of scissors as their weapon of choice because they are called the Scissor Twins. The girl's name is Scissor Woman Jemima, and Scissorman Rolf is the boy's name, and they both look like they just got back from Pride, and I love it. Best character design I have literally ever seen in a survival horror game, and I can't get enough of it. Like, me and who? Also, Jemima sounds exactly like Fran Drescher when she talks. I just wanted to mention that. Sorry, fangirl time is over. After an exceptionally long pursuit sequence in the rundown hospital, Alyssa finds a portal which takes her to a wooded area somewhere where she comes across a man walking around and chanting to himself in an unknown language. She hides behind a tree as he walks by until she realizes as he steps into the light that this is her grandfather who's been missing for the past 3 years. Alyssa runs to him, but he ignores her as he continues to walk toward the clock tower in the distance. On the ground where he stood, Alyssa finds a note written by her grandfather from 1998 talking about her 10th birthday and how much he loves her. The second note describes how he found out about the ritual of engagement and how disgusted he is by the idea of the ritual. But he also admits in this note that he's considering doing the ritual himself to achieve immortality, even if that means killing his granddaughter and ripping out her heart. Though he realizes this is an awful thing to even consider, he also says that he would be joined with her for all eternity by consuming her blood. The notes also talk about the legend of Lord Burroughs and his triangular crest. The person who is able to decipher the secrets of the crest is said to become an entity as well. The pursuit continues as Alyssa makes her way toward the clock tower once again and enters into the same room she was in before, the one filled with countless statues and the bottom of a giant spiral staircase. Inside the clock tower, Alyssa comes across a note written by an employee stating that Rolf and Jemima, the Scissor Twins, have been ordering them to bring people back to the castle. 10 last week, and this week they're asking that they bring 20 more for them to imprison and kill. During the pursuit, Alyssa manages to pull off a few cool moves, first psyching out Rolf and causing him to jump over Alyssa and straight off of a crumbled bridge, and then psyching out Jemima and causing her to dive headfirst into a flaming oven. After collecting parts of the crest of Lord Burroughs and placing them beneath the statue, a new door opens, and within it, Alyssa finds a huge painting of Lord Burroughs himself. A note beneath the painting explains that he had a daughter who was a rooter as well. He loved her very much, but his love for her did not supersede his fear of his own eventual and inevitable death. Because of this, he decided that upon his daughter's 15th birthday, he would perform the ritual of engagement by tearing out his daughter's heart and trading it for his own immortality. The day before his daughter would turn 15, though, she was in an accident that ended her life. Her father, despite the terrible fate that he had already planned for his daughter, was distraught at the news and began killing off every member of his staff, and when he ran out of staff, he began killing villagers as well, and eventually murdered his own wife when she tried to stop his rampage. His terror would only end as he was crushed between the cogs of the clock tower in an attempt to escape from an angry mob. Upon his death, he vowed that so long as the clock tower stood, he would plague the world with hate. Beneath the note sits another from her grandfather, happily stating that he had found Burroughs Castle and that Lord Burroughs had more than just a daughter. He had a son as well, named William, also known as Billy Brown. Alyssa's grandfather realized that since Brown was his original last name before changing it to Hamilton, he is actually a direct descendant of Lord Burroughs himself. The 3 parts of the crest of Lord Burroughs are A, N, and D. A for Annabelle, his daughter, N for Natalia, his wife, and D for Darcy, his first name. In the case of Alyssa's grandfather, the A is for Alyssa, the N is for Nancy, Alyssa's mom, and D is for himself. His name is Dick, and I find that to be extremely fitting for his personality. Immediately after reading the note, a projector screen in the room Alyssa is standing in turns on, showing footage of her friend Dennis being horrifically tortured by the Scissor Twins. After walking through some fun medieval torture-themed rooms and using a few Iron Maidens as elevators, Alyssa eventually finds her friend lying on a stone slab as a giant blade swings above him, and the Scissor Twins laugh maniacally and jump around the room like a couple of court jesters. Rolf walks over to the lever on the side of the blade contraption, and by pulling it, he releases the blade and it slams down on poor Dennis, slicing him in half straight down the middle. Alyssa cowers against the door for a moment in shock until Ralph says that it was just a dress rehearsal, says lights, camera, action, pulls a lever, and the stone slab that Dennis is lying on flips over to reveal that the real Dennis is actually fine and that the one that got cut in half was just a dummy. Now that Dennis's life is actually on the line, the twins confront Alyssa and basically say either she gives them her heart or they will cut Dennis in half for real this time. Dennis hears this and tells Alyssa to run and forget about him so she can save herself, but of course Alyssa refuses to let her friend die for her. She steps forward ready to fight, and the stairs crumble beneath her and she tumbles down to a stone cell floors below where she finds Book of Entities number 5. This one explains the backstory behind the twins, stating that they served under Lord Burroughs as torturers and executioners and had a particular fondness for scissors and dismembering or disemboweling people. After the death of Lord Burroughs, both siblings were stoned to death, and like all other subordinates, they were soon resurrected to continue killing more people. Beyond the door of the stone cell is what looks like her grandfather's room, complete with some of the same drawings she made for him when she was little. After ascending a ladder, Alyssa ends up back in the room with the projector, which is showing a video on the wall of her grandfather chanting while walking toward the clock tower. The projection somehow walks directly through the wall as it approaches the screen, and there in the room stands her grandfather. He takes off his hat and begins speaking to the giant painting of Lord Burroughs. He confesses to the painting of his ancestor that he understands the rage he felt after his daughter died so shortly before her 15th birthday, as his love for his granddaughter led him to murder her father. He frustratedly yells out to the entity and asks if the entity wants him to resurrect Lord Burroughs so that they together can complete the ritual engagement using the blood from Alyssa's heart. He then starts laughing maniacally and says that doesn't sound so bad because that will mean he can be with Alyssa forever. He kneels down before the painting and calls out to Lord Burroughs, saying, "Enter my body and let our flesh be fused," and so in a horrific downpouring of blood from the painting on the wall, Lord Burroughs successfully takes over her grandfather's body, and he calls out to Alyssa before evaporating into nothing. Despite everything she just saw and heard, seeing him call out to her, she ran to his side just as he turned into a puddle right before her. The twins then show up on the projector and say that now she knows everything, that it was her grandfather all along who was after her heart, and once they get her hand on her heart, Lord Burroughs and her grandfather will complete the ritual together. Knowing that Dennis is still in trouble, Alyssa runs back to the room where he's being tortured by the twins. As soon as she walks in, the boss battle starts. Jemima's name shows up on the screen as Scissor Woman, victims listed at 22, and her sentence to begins at 396 years before counting down to 0 as usual. After Jemima is defeated and bursts into confetti, Alyssa quickly tries to untie Dennis, but doesn't have the time before the battle with Rolf begins. His name is listed as Scissorman, victim count of 37, and his sentence due begins at 820. Alyssa defeats Rolf in the same way as usual, then quickly runs back over to Dennis to finish untying him, but it turns out that Rolf wasn't quite dead yet, so he starts slashing at her again until Dennis pulls the lever for the giant swinging blade and impales Rolf on it. Alyssa thanks Dennis, and he thanks her, and they hold each other's hands for a moment before Dennis decides to roll onto his back, wiggle his arms and legs around, and say, "I owe you something special," in an extremely unhinged way. Luckily, whatever the hell Dennis was doing gets interrupted by the sound of maniacal laughter coming from the man in the trench coat, telling Alyssa that she needs to come up to the top of the clock tower if she wants her mother to live. After this little interaction, Alyssa realizes that the man in the trench coat was actually her grandfather all along. Dun dun dun. She tells Dennis to wait here at the bottom of the clock tower while she goes to save her mom, and he responds by grabbing Alyssa and saying, "Don't treat me like a girl. I'm the man here." And Alyssa says, "Dennis, you may be a man, but you're not a rooter. I am." and runs from him to go save her mother. Alyssa grabs the rope in the center of the clock tower and uses it to help speed up the process of getting to the top in time. She eventually makes it to the top of the clock tower and watches as the man in the trench coat morphs into her grandfather. Her grandfather tells her that he searched for Burrow's castle non-stop for 3 years because of his pursuit of becoming one with her, saying it as though it's a good thing. He says that their destiny has been decided by the entity and it's meant to be that they'll be together forever once the ritual is complete. She begs her grandfather to come to his senses and give her mom back. She sees her mom on the floor below and runs to her, but she has been turned to stone because she had betrayed her father by marrying Philip, Alyssa's father, and by trying to prevent him from becoming one with his granddaughter through performing the ritual. Alyssa says, "Damn you, you're not my grandfather. I don't know who you are anymore, but I know that I'm a rooter, and I will destroy you and save my mother." Before her, her grandfather transforms into Lord Burrows, an altar appears, and Alyssa is flung into the air, changed into a Grecian-looking outfit, and then she's restrained and tied down to the altar. Dennis is somewhere below her and can hear her call for him as he tries to find and help her. Lord Burrows tells Alyssa that no one can help her, not even her dear mother, and uses his sword to slice the statue of her mother in half, which upsets Alyssa even further until she realizes that around her mother's neck was the last piece of the clover that she needs. But she's helpless as she watches it fall out of reach and through the cogs below. The ritual then begins, and her grandfather stands above her with a knife as the ghosts of the subordinates she's killed throughout the game stand around her, chanting along. The clock strikes 12, signifying Alyssa's 15th birthday, and her grandfather turns the knife towards her and says, "My dearest Alyssa, merge into one entity with me so that we can be together forever." As her grandfather raises the knife above his head, Alyssa screams, and just as he's about to bring it down through Alyssa's heart, Dennis climbs up and yells to Alyssa as he throws the last clover piece to her. She catches it, and now that the necklace is complete, she gains the strength to break free from her restraints, and the light of the clover dissipates all of the ghosts. The fight between Alyssa and her grandfather begins. Dennis tries to help her by jumping on her grandfather's back, but he throws him off, sending him plummeting over the edge of the clock tower. The final battle begins with Lord Burrow's name coming up on the screen with a victim count of 115 and his sentence being 2,280 years. As the fight begins drawing to a close, Lord Burrows hits Alyssa's bow out of her hand and far out of reach. She tumbles and struggles to hold on as she dangles above the endless tower of cogs below her. He says, "My dearest Alyssa, you always were a spirited child, but that's enough now. Be a good girl and grab my hand. What's the matter, Alyssa? Don't you want to live happily with me for all eternity?" During this scene, still images of her happy memories with her grandfather flash on the screen as Alyssa contemplates what to do. She pushes her grandfather's hands away, at the same time letting go of the ground she was holding onto, sending herself flying back and down toward the cogs below before her grandfather catches her and says, "Alyssa, you belong to me forever." He throws her down on the ground so they can continue their fight, and a message appears on the screen. "Alyssa, take strength from me," and she runs to her mother's statue, using her clover necklace to conjure up a flaming sword. She says, "Give up, grandfather. I won't allow the ritual to happen." She stabs her grandfather in the stomach and he plummets to his death. At the same time, the statue of Alyssa's mother reassembles itself and her mother is released from it, happily running to her daughter. They embrace, finally having been reunited after all this time, just as the clock tower begins to crumble beneath them. I especially like the symbolism of the framed photo of Alyssa, her mom, and her grandfather going up in flames as well. Alyssa wakes up in a sunny field of white clovers, holding onto her mom's necklace in her hand. She sees Dennis and runs to him. They hug and she thinks to herself, "We did it, Mom." And the game ends. So, now that you know all about the game's plot and how Alyssa fits into it, it's time to talk about Alyssa as a character. First and foremost, I want to say that I know that Clock Tower 3 is a particularly silly survival horror game. It's definitely not like a Rule of Rose or Silent Hill type, but it is a survival horror game nonetheless, even if it is rather unserious most of the time. Even though this is the case, I think that the game's plot and Alyssa's character both do a good job of kind of exemplifying the experience of being a 14-year-old girl. What I mean by that is that the role of an adolescent girl is one that is very contradictory. On one hand, you're expected to grow up and mature extremely quickly. You have to mature in many ways. For girls who are older siblings, you're expected to start taking on the role of caregiver for your younger siblings. You're supposed to be more mature emotionally, as many girls begin taking on the role of therapist for the people around them. You're supposed to grow up quickly so that you can start taking on more and more responsibilities around the home, and you're even under pressure to be more physically mature at a very young age to fit beauty standards so that men and boys will find you attractive. At the same time, you're expected to be more mature than the average boy counterpart of the same age group would be expected to be. You're also expected to remain completely innocent, naive, and obedient. You're supposed to do what you're told without question. You're supposed to remain subservient and be a good girl. You're supposed to follow blindly because you're told it's the right thing to do. Girls shouldn't be bossy, they shouldn't be loud, they should be seen and not heard, do what they're told and wear a smile on their face as they do it because they should be happy to serve those around them because that's what good girls do. Everyone repeatedly calls Alyssa little girl and yet at the same time expects her to handle all of the very serious and adult responsibilities thrown her way with the decorum of a fully grown woman. So what is she? A little girl or a young woman? As an adolescent girl, you are simultaneously both. You're a little girl when others want to belittle you, demean you, or make you seem small, weak, and insignificant. At the same time, you're also a young woman. You're expected to be mature at all times, especially when it benefits others, but not so mature that you think you're allowed to make your own decisions or stand up for yourself, God forbid. Alyssa's plight truly exemplifies these standards. Alyssa is expected, without even being given a simple reason why, to take on the immense responsibility of becoming a rooter because that's what she's supposed to do. Even though she takes on these responsibilities very much against her will, she does it because she feels an obligation to her grandfather who so badly wanted her to follow in the footsteps of her ancestors. She wants to make her grandfather proud by doing this on her own and saving her mother. Along the way, Alyssa learns a lot about her family's history. It's clear from the start that Alyssa is extremely close with her mother and her grandfather, and so to be on her own and faced with the task of becoming a rooter, helping spirits to pass on, while also trying to find her missing grandfather and save her mother's life is a lot. Even though Alyssa is often panicked, scared, and obviously overpowered by the pursuers who are after her, she never loses her confidence and her ability to overcome the challenges she faces. She thinks fast on her feet, finding ways to overtake her pursuers with her wit rather than in brute strength because they're usually at least twice her size and armed. Other than her bow during boss battles and the stunning effects of her holy water, Alyssa is generally defenseless. I know I've covered many women of survival horror on this channel who I would consider to be damsels in distress, but I don't think Alyssa is one of them. Alyssa doesn't need help. She's fully confident in her ability to defeat her pursuers, help the spirits to pass on, save her mother, and find her grandfather. All that being said, we do have to talk about Dennis. At first, when Dennis comes into Alyssa's life for the first time in a few years, it's clear that he has quite a big crush on her, and the two seem like very close childhood best friends who have been reunited at last. They goof around a lot with each other and seem very comfortable with one another. He really brings out her, sillier side. Something that's more age-appropriate and kind of childish, because at the end of the day, she is a child, technically. Dennis expresses a lot of interest in helping Alyssa, even though she doesn't really seem to want his help, or need it for that matter. I think Dennis's character, although kind of unnecessary, does a good job of helping to humanize Alyssa and to provide comfort for her throughout the plot when no one else is around to. He does seem like a good friend for her. It just seems like he doesn't want Alyssa to do things on her own, both for her own safety and also a bit because he wants to prove himself to her. At the end of the game, Dennis says to Alyssa, "Don't treat me like a girl, I'm the man here." I feel like this interaction kind of tells you a lot about what is expected of him because of his gender. I know I never talk about that, but I think Dennis feels like because he's a man, he should be the one protecting her and fighting her battles for her, because that's what men are supposed to do. On the other hand, Alyssa knows that although that's how it usually is, she can fight her own battles without his help. Alyssa also shows a great deal of empathy throughout this game, to the spirits that she's helping, to her mother, her grandfather, her father, and to Dennis. For the spirits, she leads them to peace, she comforts them when they cry, and she does what she can to help them find happiness again, even when it puts her in harm's way. For her mother, she misses her immensely and clearly has a very close relationship with her. For her grandfather, she goes from missing him in his absence to wanting to make him proud after finding his notes, to wanting to help him see the error of his ways, because even in the moments where she hears him confess not only to killing her father, but intending to kill her for purely selfish reasons disguised as well-meaning wishes, even as all of these terrible things about her grandfather come to life, she still cares for him. She still runs to his side as he dissipates into nothing before her very eyes. She still wants to be with him, just not in the way that he wants. As for Dennis, during the part of the game where he's tied to the stone slab and is about to be sliced in half, he tells Alyssa to forget about him and run for her life, And even though she very well could have done that, Dennis provided comfort for her and helped her emotionally throughout this entire experience. And so she fights as hard as she can to free him, even though that is the significantly more dangerous option. I also think that at the end of the game, where Alyssa calls out to Dennis while she's strapped down to the altar and just about to have her chest torn open by her grandfather, I think it really shows the comfort she feels in just knowing that he's there. She knows that even though she can do this on her own, there's nothing wrong with asking for help when you need it, especially when you know that your friend is reliable and truly cares for you. At the end of the day, Dennis's help, albeit very minimal, is what gives her that last bit of strength she needs to finish this fight once and for all. Back to her grandfather for a moment, I want to talk about the ending of the game because I feel that everything that happens in the final fight of the game is the most telling about Alyssa. As Alyssa dangles above the plummeting depths of cogs below her at the top of the clock tower, her grandfather hovers above her and says, "My dearest Alyssa, you always were a spirited child, but that's enough now. Be a good girl and grab my hand. What's the matter, Alyssa? Don't you want to live happily with me for all eternity?" And I feel that this best exemplifies the whole problem. Thus far in the game, Alyssa has had no choice about anything. She had no choice but to go away to boarding school, no choice but to become a rooter and put herself in harm's way to try to help these spirits to move on. No choice but to save her mother and find her grandfather. She fights tooth and nail, desperately trying to get her mother back, and when she finally finds her grandfather, he's been the one plotting to kill her all along. He killed her father so that he wouldn't be able to stop her from becoming a rooter. He kidnapped his own daughter so that Alyssa's mother could no longer protect her. And now he's found a way to disguise his own selfish desire to achieve immortality at the expense of his granddaughter's life as a moral problem for Alyssa to face, not him. Alyssa would be wrong to say no to her grandfather. After all, he just wants to be with her forever, and what's so wrong about that? It would be selfish to say no to him. Didn't she love him? If she loved him, she should have no problem just being good and letting him rip her heart out. What was wrong with her? Why would she want to save her mother and herself at the expense of her grandfather's feelings? During this scene, images of Alyssa's childhood of her mother, and her grandfather all looking happy together flash on the screen before Alyssa, for the very first time, gets to make a decision that the dominating patriarch of her family wouldn't approve of. She decides that it would be better to die of her own volition than to allow her grandfather to take advantage of her anymore. Even that decision her grandfather wouldn't allow, as he snatches her up and throws her to the ground, saying, "Alyssa, you belong to me forever." The dominating patriarch of the family, the grandfather, is something that is so important to this game. He dominates all those around him. First, he controlled his own daughter, forcing her into becoming a rooter herself, and when she was old enough and had a daughter of her own, he killed her husband, the father of her child, because he didn't approve of him personally. He kept his daughter and granddaughter under his roof and under his thumb, all the time plotting how to achieve immortality at the expense of his granddaughter's life, as he ushered her along down the same path as all the rooter women that had come before her, despite knowing the risks. In the cemetery, we saw the many young rooter women who had died doing the exact thing Alyssa was forced into. And what was the benefit of any of it? The powers that these women held, is it really power if it's being used against you for the benefit of someone else? And the risk of it all, if you don't get your heart ripped out of your chest and survive, you're meant to turn 20 years old, get married, and have babies so that you can quickly continue the rooter bloodline so that your own daughter can be subjected to the same terror and the same potentially horrific death awaiting her. Alyssa's mother knew this. She tried to stop it from happening when she was young, and as Alyssa grew and she learned of her father's plan to kill Alyssa, she tried even harder to put a stop to things before it was too late. She put herself in the warpath of her father to try and save her daughter. The line that appears before the very last fight of the game, "Alyssa takes strength from me," I think tells you a lot about the relationship between Alyssa and her mother. At the end of the day, her mother was really the only person she could trust to take care of her without some sort of ulterior motive behind their love. She wants what's best for her. She wants to protect her and keep her safe, even if that means putting herself in harm's way to do it. She wants her daughter ultimately just to be happy and to know how strong she is. Watching Alyssa use her mother's statue to make a weapon to kill her grandfather with and unleash them both from under his domineering and oppressive foot is really something special. I know not every adolescent girl has the best relationship with their mother, but I do think for those of us who have been lucky enough to have a mom that always sticks by their side through thick and thin, this really does hold true. Sometimes when everything goes wrong and you're in a horrible situation and you have no idea how to get out of it, there really is no relationship stronger than that of a girl and her mother. Moms were all adolescent girls once upon a time, subject to the same awful things young girls have always been subject to. They've dealt with creeps, they've dealt with men trying to control their lives, and even when they're still dealing with those things themselves, they want their daughters to have a better life than they did, so they will do whatever it takes to make that happen for them. And I feel that this is especially true of Alyssa and her mother. Now, last but not least, I know this is usually the most controversial part of my Women of Survival Horror videos, and usually the part of the video where I sometimes get some particularly nasty comments. We have to talk about the alternate costumes. Sorry, we have to do it. It's unavoidable. I know people love to get to this part of my video and then comment something along the lines of, "Ugh, of course you brought up the alternate costumes. Women are so sensitive. Get over it. You're reading too much into it. You're just looking for something to be upset about." To that I'd like to say, this series is called the Women of Survival Horror, and I, a woman, am making these videos. And so yes, we will be talking about how women generally are portrayed in media, and one of the ways that women are generally portrayed in media, I'm afraid, are as sex objects. So we do have to talk about it. Sorry. I want to start by saying that I don't feel that Alyssa's character in her normal default costume is over-sexualized in any way. There are no sexual overtones to the game. She doesn't have any particularly over-sexualized animations like Ashley from the original Resident Evil 4 or Fiona from Clock Tower. Generally, Alyssa acts like and is treated like she is 14 years old, which is a very good thing and honestly a relief. Usually in survival horror games, the over-sexualization of female characters within the plot is extremely relevant. However, lucky for us, Alyssa as a character is generally treated with respect from the creators, and even her relationship with a potential love interest like Dennis is age appropriate and doesn't feel like she's being put in any sort of provocative or inappropriate situations. However, for some reason, in the Western version of Clock Tower 3, there were a few new alternate costumes that were added that weren't present in the original Japanese version of the game. The ones worth mentioning are the cowgirl costume, the leather queen costume, and the gladiator costume. I'm going to put up images on the screen just so you can see what I'm talking about. I shouldn't really need to have to say it, but these are very obviously inappropriate and over-sexualized costumes, especially for a character who is 14 years old. In case you're for some reason thinking to yourself right now, "Oh, they're not that bad, you're just being dramatic," I want to ask you a question. Do you think that a 14-year-old, which is a 9th grader, a freshman in high school, actually, she could still be an 8th grader in middle school at that age, should be wearing anything that is called a leather queen costume? Should they be wearing BDSM gear and walking around wearing a bra as a shirt? Should they be wearing a suit of armor that has underwear for pants? No! Obviously not. These are all very obviously inappropriate for a 14-year-old. And just to address another comment I usually get in regards to talking about alternate costumes in these sorts of videos, this is a comment I found while looking for Clock Tower 3 content online. So yes, people do look at Alyssa in these costumes and find it sexy. I'm not just saying, "Oh, look at these costumes, they're way over-sexualized," for no good reason. It's not an argument I'm making up out of thin air. There are a million ways to make a cowgirl costume that doesn't involve using bra as a shirt. There are a million ways to make a female suit of armor that has pants on the bottom. These are deliberate choices to try to make Alyssa, a 14-year-old, look sexy and be physically appealing to male audiences, and yes, I do find that kind of disturbing. Literally, if it were not for the alternate costumes, I wouldn't have even had to use the word over-sexualized in this video, but because survival horror games aren't really made with a female audience in mind, even when they do have female protagonists, many aspects of these protagonists are made to appeal to the men who will likely be the ones playing these games. Fiona from Haunting Ground has jiggle physics, Ashley from Resident Evil 4 has upskirt shots, Eriko from Illbleed has clothes that fall apart when she takes damage, and Alyssa from Clock Tower has sexy unlockable outfits. Another argument I often see when I talk about the over-sexualization of women, and in this case, girls, in survival horror games is, what does it matter? It's not like they're a real person, who cares? And all I have to say is that it matters because it sends a terrible message to the players of the game and to the industry that makes them. It says, hey, people don't want to play a game where you have to play as a weak, defenseless woman unless you make her super sexy, because sex appeal is the only part of a female character that matters to mainstream audiences. And so this will just keep happening over and over again unless something is done to change it. And until then, I will be here making these videos, so there's still a discussion going on about how women are portrayed in survival horror games, since the intended audiences of these games don't include the women who are like the protagonists in the games that they put out. Only the men who are interested in watching them breast boobily down the stairs. I'm here. And I care about these games, and as much as I love them and find comfort in this genre, I also recognize how problematic it can be, especially in regards to the female characters within it, which is exactly why I started this series in the first place. I want to thank you all for watching and sticking with me till the end because I know this was a long one. Let me know down below in the comments how you feel about Clock Tower 3, since I know that the general consensus on this game can be kind of all over the place, with some people loving it and some people thinking it's just way too silly. Personally, I love how silly it is. I'm glad not every game I cover is ridiculously dark and depressing because it kind of gives me a mental break while still getting to talk about something I love. Anywho, I hope you all have a good day or night or whatever time it is wherever you are, and I will see you all next time. Oh, and happy Halloween!